Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Pennsylvania primary election results from Tuesday night's elections. We're also going to be taking a look at the other states' primaries that also happened on Tuesday because there's a lot to go over and a lot of things happened on Tuesday night, and there's a number of trends that I want to go into. But first we're going to look at the big key races from Tuesday night, and of course those are the Pennsylvania primaries. I think these were the most important primaries of the entire night. Of course, on the Democratic side, there's no real surprise here. John Fetterman landslided Conor Lamb and Malcolm Kenyatta in the primary. This was an interesting race, too, because early on, Fetterman was always the favorite to win this primary, even though the Democratic establishment tried to get behind Lamb and he had all these endorsements from all over the state. It didn't really matter. The voters wanted a more progressive candidate on the Democratic side, and they ultimately backed Fetterman in huge numbers. Now, Fetterman is also a statewide official, so he has a lot more name recognition, but Conor Lamb also was very well known because in 2018, his special election, where he won in a Trump plus 19 district, really made a lot of big headlines and got Democrats energized about the midterms going ahead. But ultimately, he sort of fell off. He had all that support, yet it really didn't materialize, and it seems like the Democratic Party kind of gave up and just consolidated around Fetterman, which, I think is a smart decision just because it's good to have the base united around one candidate. And one thing you'll notice in the Republican primaries is that's anything but the case. And I think, Democrats are playing their cards right because this is a year that's not going to be good to them. All polls, everything indicates that. Every poll we've seen indicates that. All of the trends that we're seeing in these states indicate that. Yet they're playing their cards right. They're getting the base consolidated around one candidate early. They're fundraising all over the place. They're fundraising millions and millions of dollars, especially Josh Shapiro on the governor's side of the ticket. So, the Democrats are playing their cards right in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know if Fetterman would have been the strongest general election candidate, but the fact that everyone kind of got behind him early is important when it comes to galvanizing the base in the general. Now, when we go down to the Republican side, this is the total opposite of what happened in the Democratic primary. This was a super divided primary. You had Kathy Barnett, who was sort of the, trying to bill herself as the most Trumpian candidate, kind of surging right at the end in the final days of the primary. We'll just go back up to the polls there. I think it was within the final week. Yeah, really the beginning of May, she started to surge back up. And I guess you could see this mainly in mid-April, too. Her poll numbers started to go up. But she had a surge right at the end that kind of made things extremely close as per the polling, but these results never actually materialized. Kathy Barnett, for all the attention she was getting, ultimately kind of slipped down into a distant third, and it really was between Dr. Oz and David McCormick, which was a real surprise to everyone, myself included. My final prediction, I thought this would be a race between Oz and Barnett, but ultimately Oz would triumph. Now it looks like it's a race between Oz and McCormick. And if I were to put money on it, I still think Dr. Oz is going to win this primary, but it's going to be a razor thin margin. I mean, as of right now, you only have 1,300 votes separating these candidates thereabout. So super, super close. This is recount territory, obviously. We might not know the actual winner. I think Oz either has or will shortly declare victory in this race, but I think ultimately he will be the Republican nominee. Now, the electoral map is baffling to me because you have a lot of these rural counties, particularly in central PA and western PA, that are, going for David McCormick, and in some cases not even by small margins. He won Allegheny by about 7 or 8. This is kind of where he's from. He was born in Washington County. He won that by 4. So, some of these rural counties, somebody like David McCormick doesn't really make a whole lot of sense winning these areas. These are sort of the Trump base, the populist voting base of the Republican Party. Yet at the end of the day, McCormick ends up having the advantage in almost all of these counties. Now, one of the reasons for that is Kathy Barnett. Kathy Barnett took a lot of votes away from Dr. Oz, and the biggest fear from some people in the Republican Party was that Barnett was going to play spoiler for Oz and McCormick would win, and that looks like it's almost going to be the case. I think Oz is going to pull through in the end by a very narrow margin, but that almost came to fruition. And, people like Sean Hannity and others in the Republican Party really helped to prop up Oz in the final days to get him over the finish line. Otherwise, David McCormick would have been the nominee. He's much more of a establishment Bush-type conservative, has a very socially liberal past, as does Oz, though. But, this primary has really shown the divisions within the Republican Party and ultimately proves that, Trumpism as an ideology can exist without Trump. Now, Trump did endorse Oz, but Kathy Barnett was running to the right of Oz, and, she had a poll surge at the end, which a lot of people thought would jeopardize Oz's chances. There were plenty of people predicting that Kathy Barnett was going to win the nomination. And, looking at the final results, that's ridiculous, but at the time, the polls only had her down 2.5 points to Oz, really. So it wasn't unlikely, but I think a lot of the later polls underestimated McCormick, and that's why this result is such a shock, because in the polling aggregate, David McCormick was at 19.6%. So he was in third, and quite comfortably so. And ultimately, that's not the result we ended up getting. Now, Oz's strongest areas were in northeastern PA. These were also the strongest areas for Lou Barletta, and we'll talk about him in just a few minutes. Kathy Barnett did well in Montgomery County, which is where she's from, Berks and Lancaster. She's kind of from this region of southeastern PA. McCormick winning Chester County is very expected. This is a very establishment county. This is a Romney County. This is a Clinton-Toomey County. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Delaware County is another county where Toomey did very well over Donald Trump back in 2016. And it's trended to the left pretty considerably. So it makes sense that David McCormick is winning these areas. Oz winning northeastern PA, that really is an area of the state that saved him. Philadelphia, which really doesn't have a whole lot of votes in a Republican primary, though, but Oz won that area really handedly. But mainly northeastern PA is to thank for Oz's victory. Lackawanna County going for Oz by 11, Luzerne County going to Oz by over 6. So, this region of PA saved Dr. Oz. And, McCormick winning in these central and rural counties is really baffling. But when you take into consideration that most voters aren't voting based on ideology, a lot of people saw McCormick as the candidate that wasn't Oz or Barnett, because there were people that had reservations for both, and ultimately they ended up going for McCormick. But I think if you didn't see as much of a vote split between Oz and Barnett, Oz would have won a lot more of these rural counties, especially these counties where, like Susquehanna, for instance, where you have, David McCormick only up by about 2. So all of these results could have changed. At the end of the day, though, it could take a few days to actually call Pennsylvania. I think Oz will end up being the Republican nominee, but it's going to be a very, very, very close. And it's going to be within 1,000 to a couple hundred votes when it's all said and done. So moving down to the governor's primary, this was another primary. This wasn't really as contentious. The polls in this primary were pretty lopsided in favor of Mastriano. Now, what's interesting here is that just like in the Senate primary, there's a lot of Republican infighting about this primary as well, because there's a lot of people in the Republican base that think that Doug Mastriano is not an electable candidate, that he's going to be a much tougher candidate to win in the general election than somebody like Lou Barletta, who is more of the safe choice. Now, what's interesting about these two candidates, both of them are incredibly loyal to Donald Trump, but Mastriano kind of took it to a new extreme. And I think a lot of the things that he supported, going to the Capitol back in January, his rhetoric on various other issues like election integrity, things like that, is going to hurt him among independent voters. Even if Barletta has similar views, he doesn't have the bad optics and the bad baggage to go up in a general election. And Lou Barletta also is a much more presentable candidate. But there's no denying that the rural base of the Republican Party turned out for Mastriano in huge numbers. I mean, him winning by 24 points with 44% of the vote means that people who voted for Oz, McCormick, and Barnett also voted for Mastriano. So this primary was a lot less divisive than the other one. There was a last-ditch effort by the Pennsylvania Republican establishment to try and back Lou Barletta, but it was too late. It was too little too late, and it was very clear in the final days that there was no making up the ground. Mastriano had a 14-point lead in the polls. It was pretty obvious he was probably going to overperform that at the end of the day, and there was no stopping this. If the Republican establishment really wanted to stop Mastriano and back Barletta, they should have done it back in the summer when Barletta was ahead. This would have been a totally different race. So, I mean, we'll see what ends up happening, come the general election. I think Mastriano has a lot of work to do to kind of clean up his image to a general electorate. Obviously, midterms are all about turnout, and I think that, Republican turnout is going to be a lot higher than Democratic turnout, just as a rule of thumb, because it's a midterm year. But that doesn't mean all the Republicans are going to back Mastriano. There might be a few, especially in these suburban counties, that vote for Oz and Shapiro. And, we've seen that kind of down ballot effect before. I'll make another video on Josh Shapiro later this week, because I do want to talk about his prospects as well, because I do think he's a very strong candidate. There's some people that say he's overhyped. as a candidate, but I really want to go into why I don't think that's true and why I think he's going to be a real challenge to take on in the general election for the Republicans. Now, looking down at some of the House primaries, Jim Bognet, who ran back in 2020 in the 8th District, he won his primary handedly against his opponent. Of course, on the Democratic side of things, you had Summer Lee, who's a progressive Democrat, beat sort of a more moderate Democrat in the 12th District. That's going to make things very interesting in the House come the general. But on the Republican side, I mean, there wasn't really a whole lot of contentious primaries. I mean, District 7 I don't think has been called yet, although it looks like Lisa Scheller is going to end up being the nominee. But, the rest of these races, a lot of them were uncontested. We had 3 seats that were totally uncontested. The Democrats didn't even bother to run candidates there because these districts are so red. And, certain Republicans, Brian Fitzpatrick, which, a lot of Republicans think would describe as a rhino for some of his positions. He voted for the infrastructure bill, votes for gun control. He won his primary pretty handedly. So it looks like Republicans in that area are very behind somebody like Brian Fitzpatrick because he is extremely electable. He won by a pretty wide margin back in 2020. He won by, I think, a safe margin, despite this district going to Joe Biden. So he's a pretty strong House candidate to have, and I think that's ultimately why Republicans didn't really put up a real fight against him. Now, moving on to the state of North Carolina, Sherry Beasley on the Democratic side easily won the Democratic nomination. She was the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. She's probably going to go on to lose this election, given that this is North Carolina, and all of the polls in this state have indicated that this is likely going to be an easy win for the GOP. If we just take a look at the polls for the general election, Ted Budd is up in every poll. There's one poll that's a Democratic-leaning poll where he's tied. The last poll we have, which is our leading poll, interesting enough, only has him up by 1. But all of these other polls have Ted Budd up by a pretty significant margin. I ultimately think that he's going to end up beating Sherry Beasley in the general by a likely margin, probably somewhere around 6 to 7 points, depending. Now, Ted Budd won his primary by a gigantic margin. He did better than I thought he was going to do. I had him at about 56% of the vote, but I had McCrory at 31%, so I completely overestimated McCrory. He was a much weaker candidate than I gave him credit for. He barely won his home county of Mecklenburg. In fact, he only won it by 0.3%, so Ted Budd almost won every county in the entire state, and it wasn't even close. And that Trump endorsement early on in the primary, I think, really made the difference. And if Oz had had the endorsement of Donald Trump way back in the summer, way back earlier in the year, like Ted Budd did, I don't even think this Pennsylvania Republican primary would be anywhere near as close as it was. And I think the base would have gotten behind Oz a lot quicker. But ultimately, we didn't see that. And I know Oz jumped in the race in December, but if Trump had endorsed Oz right away, I think it would have been a much less contentious primary on the Republican side of things. So, there were a couple of interesting results also on the House level. You had Madison Cawthorn lose his primary to Chuck Edwards by about 2.5 points. This was not too surprising a result given all these scandals that came out about Madison Cawthorn doing a lot of sus things and, criticizing the establishment. And ultimately, they came out against him in a vengeance and, had this smear campaign against Madison Cawthorn. And ultimately, with all this dirt out in the ether, Republican voters decided it was time to pick somebody else as their nominee for the 11th. So Madison Cawthorn ultimately lost his primary, probably ending his career in politics. I don't really see him with much of a political future. Obviously, if he had stayed in the House for a while, he probably would have moved up House leadership and perhaps even ran for statewide office, probably maybe for Senate or something like that, for Tom Tillis' seat maybe in 2026 or something like that. So it would have been interesting to see where he would have went. But looking at these House results, the 13th District, Bo Hines won that primary. The 13th is important because this is a very competitive district outside of Raleigh. It kind of splits Wake County in half, so you have only northern Wake County in one district, and then of course you have the rest of suburban Wake County and other counties in the 13th District. I think that's a likely Republican district. It's an R+3. It's an open seat, but I think Republicans are going to do fairly well there. Bo Hines, I think, is a really good candidate, and ultimately I think Republicans will probably do well in those seats. So going on to the state of Oregon now, incumbent Senator Ron Wyden winning his Democratic primary. No shock there. Jo Ray Perkins looks like she's going to win the Republican Senate primary. She's a very bad candidate, I think, for the Republicans. She subscribes to a lot of Q conspiracy theories and things like that. So, ultimately, I don't really think she's going to go anywhere. This race really wasn't competitive anyway, but I think, her ceiling is probably going to be about 42% given this red wave year. What I'm really interested in is the governor's race, because the governor's race is a potential to be extremely competitive. You have Tina Kotek, the Democratic nominee, which is basically, a lot of people are saying Kate Brown 2.0, and Kate Brown is not a very popular governor in the state of Oregon. Kotek also has to worry about Betsy Johnson, who is a independent, more moderate Democrat running in the race. She's running third party. And I think ultimately she's going to hurt Kotek come the general election, especially given already that this race was expected to be close. So Republicans are handed this race on a silver platter. Now, obviously, they're going to have to work really hard for it. Christine Drazan is what I've seen a really good candidate. She could put up a really good fight for the Republicans. And we'll see whether the Republicans will actually be successful in winning the governorship in Oregon. For the first time in 36 years, almost 4 decades, there's not been a Republican governor in the state of Oregon. So if it were to happen, it would be 2022. It would be during a red wave year. We'll see. We'll see if she could kind of pull a Glenn Youngkin, kind of keeping the Trump coalition together in rural areas while also appealing to suburban voters. That's really the key. And, I think the Youngkin coalition is something more Republicans should really run on, because I think that's a real winning coalition when it comes to winning in blue states like Oregon, like in Virginia. And, it could probably even be employed in Colorado, but I don't really think any of the Republican candidates over there will try and do that. Republicans would have real big opportunities if they all employed this strategy. And, I think some might. I don't know. We'll see what Mark Ronchetti decides to do in New Mexico. I think he's going to run a really close race there. And I think Michelle Lujan Grisham should be worried, because I think in the matchup between him and her, she's only up by 4. And maybe we'll do another video kind of re-examining New Mexico. But I think, there's a lot of states in which Republicans are going to make it close this year. And, it would be interesting to see, certain states like Oregon elect Republican governors when perhaps maybe a state like Pennsylvania doesn't. So we'll see how that turns out. But moving on to Idaho, you had a few unsuccessful primary attempts. You had Mike Crapo, the Republican senator from Idaho. There were some primary challengers against him. He ultimately won 67.1% of the vote. No real competitive race here. Brad Little, a bit closer. Janice McGeehan, rather, was running to the right of Brad Little. Brad Little was, by some people's metrics, a little too hard on COVID in a state, especially as red as Idaho, and the base kind of came out against him, but ultimately Brad Little survived. He won by 30 points. Janice McGeehan had the endorsement of Trump, but Trump really didn't do a whole lot to make sure she won this primary. And ultimately, she did better than I expected. This was, a better margin. I thought Brad Little would probably get about 60% of the vote, and that was not the case. So McGeehan did better than I thought, but ultimately, this was kind of a fruitless effort. One primary challenge that actually was successful was in the Attorney General's race. You had Attorney General Wasden of Idaho, who I think was one of the longest serving Attorney General, was ousted by Raul Labrador, who was I think he was Idaho's second congressman. And this was a pretty big victory, too. He won 51% of the vote to 38% of the vote. So for an incumbent, this is a brutal defeat in the primary. And ultimately, it goes to show you that, incumbents are not immune to primary challenges, on the Republican side or the Democratic side. We saw that. Oh, I forgot to mention in Oregon, Kurt Schrader. So Kurt Schrader, his election in the 5th district is one example in which a primary challenge might be successful. Currently, he's down by about 20 points, but there's a lot of votes still outstanding, and I believe those are all in Clackamas County, which is his home county. Here, let's take a look at those now, because I think there was some reporting error, and only 8% of the vote out of Clackamas is even reporting, only 42% out of Marion County, so really not a lot of the vote reporting, and the vote that is reporting is coming in strong for the progressive in this race. So we'll see how this election ends up turning out. Schrader was more of a moderate Blue Dog Democrat. I think he was the leader of the Blue Dog Democrat caucus, or is. Ultimately, this is a D+3 seat. So if this is a loss for Schrader, this could put the seat in a lot more jeopardy than it otherwise would have been. But again, Schrader's still not immune. He still could have lost anyway. in the red wave year, but it will be interesting to see how this race turns out. One theme throughout all of these primaries, though, is that both parties are getting less content with the establishment. You saw that in Pennsylvania with the nomination of John Fetterman. You're seeing it here in Oregon. You saw it in Pittsburgh, in Idaho. So all over the country, both red and blue, you're seeing anti-establishment waves throughout the midterm. And I really think that goes to show that many people are tired of the political establishment of both parties, and they want more real policies that will actually impact their daily lives instead of the gridlock that they normally get in Washington. So the last state we're going to look at is Kentucky. Not a lot to talk about here. Rand Paul won his primary by a landslide. No surprise. He's an incumbent senator from Kentucky, Republican. And of course, we have Charles Booker, who on the Democratic side, the progressive candidate, likely will lose to Rand Paul by a pretty large margin, given that 2022 will be a very good year for Republicans. And also, Kentucky is a red state anyway. So, a lot of people thought that Mitch McConnell was going to lose his race back in 2020. Wasn't even close. People said that in 2014. That whole thing was really just a scheme for fundraising. These candidates really didn't have a chance. Amy McGrath in 2020 didn't have a chance against Mitch McConnell. It was all just to funnel money probably to the DNC. Same with Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. Any real election analyst would have told you that race wasn't going to flip. And it ultimately didn't. Lindsey Graham won by like 10 points, and Mitch McConnell, I think, won by like over 20. So it really goes to show you. But those are really the big victories. Charles Booker is an interesting one because he is a very progressive candidate, and he's been trying to run a campaign to try and unite Democrats in the cities, like Louisville and Lexington, and also rural coal mining Democrats that may have left the party and become Republicans. So it would be interesting to see kind of how well he performs. But really, the eyes of the nation are probably going to be on Pennsylvania as we try and figure out who the actual nominee for the Republicans is going to be. My money's on Oz, but we'll see what happens at the end of the day. Anyway, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.